You're listening to Unlocking Vulnerability, a podcast produced by Helen Pettifer, helping you better understand consumer vulnerability. Hello, I'm Helen Pettifer and welcome to Unlocking Vulnerability. In this episode, we're going to be looking at GDPR and what it means when it comes to vulnerable customers. And I'm excited to be joined by Jonathan Lane of Haines. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Hello.
Tell us a little bit more about you and what you do.
Well, first, thank you for asking me to take part in this. I'm a business strategy advisor with Haines based in Aylesbury in Berkhamsted. Haines is a nationally based accountancy company. My role takes the Haines offer beyond the traditional boundaries of accountancy, if you like. Together with my business partner, Pippa Hutchinson, we help SME businesses in a number of ways. For example, we provide business health checks, develop bespoke growth plans, operate as an external board, improve business efficiency, and most importantly, in the context of today's discussions, help our clients develop tailored and balanced responses to their responsibilities under GDPR.
That's great, thank you. And obviously your last point about GDPR is the main reason I've invited you to join me today. So let's start our conversation with, what is GDPR?
Right, as most people will know, Helen, GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a regulation that was developed by the EU and will continue to apply to the UK after we've left. It's really an update of the historic legislation from 1998 to bring it in line with the current technological changes, which you can imagine are pretty significant. For example, the ever-present social media.
Oh, yes.
In particular, it recognises that from an individual's perspective, that's you and me as private people and as employees, our personal data is a valuable commodity which really needs to be treated with respect and in a way that we are comfortable with. So the rights of the individuals and the responsibility of organisations and businesses have been significantly enhanced by the new regulation.
Brilliant. So from my basic understanding of GDPR, there are different articles, with one being Article 9, special categories. So what does this mean or entail?
Right, GDPR is in essence predicated around how a business or an organisation responds to the nature and level of the risk to the individual. That's the data subject used in the jargon. Rather than the risk to the business itself, risk here is seen as the potential severity of any impact on the individual if the integrity of that data is compromised and the likelihood of any unlawful disclosure taking place. So, Article 9 itself sets out that some types of personal data are likely to be more sensitive and gives them extra protection. Article 9 defines those special categories and includes within that list is the health of a data subject, a person. Health is further defined in terms of the physical or mental health of an individual, including past, current or future health status.
That's brilliant, and that's great to hear that it's actually thinking about the future. So it's not just about looking after the customer today, it's actually thinking about them in the future as well.
Indeed, and that's really important. Article 9 goes on to define the special conditions under which it is permissible for a business or organisation to process such sensitive data. In essence, Article 9 prohibits the processing of special category data. However, there are 10 exemptions, which are known as conditions for processing such data. The key ones for most businesses or organisations are: the individual gives their consent, it's needed by law for employment, social services or social protection reasons, it's in the vital interests of that individual, or it's made public by that individual, manifestly put into the public domain is the phrase that's used. There are, of course, the other 6, which may be more relevant in other specific circumstances.
Okay.
Now, you're not alone here, because the Information Commissioner's Office, or the ICO as we call it, has issued a 38-page guidance document on special category data last November. For those of your listeners who want to explore these issues in a little more detail, and it's readily available from the ICO website.
Brilliant, and you'll find that link in the episode details as well. We've included that. So thank you. So again, from my understanding, there are 6 principles within GDPR. How do these 6 principles relate to vulnerable customers?
Right, we need to step back a little from special categories to answer that question properly. The whole issue of processing of any personal data that falls within GDPR is governed by these 6 principles. And as importantly a business or organisation's compliance with the regulation itself is judged against those 6 principles. Now, in shorthand, these principles can be summarised as follows. A, lawfulness, fairness and transparency. B, purpose limitation. That is, you collect and process that personal data for a specific purpose only. C, data limitation. You collect and process the minimum amount of personal data to achieve that specific purpose. D, accuracy. You take every reasonable step to collect accurate personal data for that purpose and have in place systems to correct any errors without undue delay. E, storage limitation. You keep that personal data only for the minimum time necessary. And lastly, F, integrity and confidentiality. You ensure appropriate security throughout the processing chain in a manner reflecting the sensitivity of that personal data. So, to go back to your original point, Helen, about the potential impact of these 6 principles on vulnerable customers, it's really a matter of looking at each principle from the Article 9 perspective. So, for example, Principle A says you must have a legal base, and that's set out in Article 6, and there are 6. The first is consent, then it's part of a contractual relationship, it might be required by law, which is the third one, it's in the vital interest of the individual, it's in the broader public interest, and it could be part of a legitimate business interest, which the 6th one is probably the most flexible of those available. But Article 9, the special category data article, says you must have a relevant condition as well. That is one of those 10 exceptions I highlighted earlier. So it's a 2-phase exercise, a legal basis plus a specific exception. And they don't have to be the same thing.
No, perfect.
Now, to go back to the 6 principles, Article F focuses on the appropriate level of security. The key question here would be what sort of additional measures might be needed to ensure the security of such higher risk personal data. Remember, this is all about having an appropriate response to the perceived severity and likelihood of that data being compromised. And the other 4 principles would need to be considered in a like manner in the specific circumstances of that particular processing arrangement.
Perfect. So when it comes to vulnerable customers, and ideally Principle B, with purpose limitation, it's all about collecting the relevant information from that customer to meet their specific needs.
Absolutely. Indeed. Nicely put.
Thank you.
But to return to security again for the moment, because that's often at the nub of the issue.
Yes.
It's worth looking at what Article 32 specifically says about security and the responsibility of that business or organisation doing the processing. And I'm afraid here I will quote directly from the regulation, if I may, so I apologise for the legal nature of the following statement. It says, taking into account the state of the art, the cost of implementation, and the nature, scope, context and purposes for processing, as well as the risk of varying likelihood and severity for the rights and freedoms of natural persons, that's the data subject, you and me, the controller and the processor shall implement appropriate technical and organisational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk. So it's all about proportionality, based around some sort of analysis of what that risk and severity might be.
Yes.
And obviously Article 9 data ratchets that up to a degree.
Perfect. So thinking about security then, I mean, obviously the ICO is probably thinking about sort of external data breaches. But what about internally as well? How important is internal security between departments?
Again, it goes back to how you design the process in the organisation. For example, if you have a traditional B2B business, the sales department's engagement with its data subjects will be mainly other business owners, members of businesses whose personal data are typically well known because they're put out there for the business's purposes. But again, the information around the business's staff,
yes,
which is normally under control of an HR department or some HR lead, may well contain health data, which may indeed be of a sensitive nature, which is only really relevant to the manager and the HR department themselves.
Yes.
So there is no need for that data to be available to the sales team. So most organisations put in place some form of access control system so only the relevant people have access to the relevant data. So that would be proportionate and appropriate, both in terms of security, but also it's an organisational measure.
Yes, perfect.
That sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's great. So many organisations that I'm speaking to especially are looking for customers, especially vulnerable customers, to self-disclose information on what their specific needs are and what the company can do to support them. How should companies be going about getting that information, recording, storing and using that information from the customers?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Helen. But I'm afraid it's rather hard to give you a specific short answer here. One of the themes coming out of today's conversation is that GDPR is all about coming up with a tailored response that suits the specific circumstances facing the business or the organisation in that relevant processing activity. So you really need to map out at least some of the following issues, but not necessarily, I'm suggesting, in this order. So firstly, what are you actually trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? What's the purpose of that particular processing activity? What are the legal basis and legal conditions you think apply to those specific circumstances? What's the type and minimum amount of personal data you need to collect to ensure that processing purpose is handled fairly? How do you ensure its accuracy? How are you going to handle and store that data safely, and for how long? And in the light of the conversation, what access controls might you want to put in place? And how do you do all that in a transparent manner? The first principle is all about being transparent, including fairness and that sort of thing. So are you going to some way explain this in privacy notices? Are there going to be tailored privacy notices that are specifically available to the vulnerable customers, or whatever? It's how you're going to approach that more open face of data protection.
Yes. And actually you can put a section in the vulnerable customer policy that then does highlight a section on the GDPR compliance as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the way to look at it. So it's actually wrapped up in the whole thing, and it's integrated, if you like.
Yes, exactly.
But I think the overall approach, the overall key thing for me is that as a business or organisation is that you develop an argued, rational and documented case for that process of the activity. One which is subject to a regular review and audit, because we live in a dynamic world and things keep changing. But on a related note, within GDPR, there is something called a data protection impact assessment, in the jargon DPIAs, and that's all set out under Article 35. And in certain high-risk circumstances, its use is mandatory. The regulation says you must do this. But it can also be employed in other cases as a good practice tool. And the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, has a DPIA sample template on its website. Again, we can provide the link.
Yes.
And that can be a useful starting point for considering how to look at data protection in particular circumstances.
Yes.
But I thought the last point to make on this is if in doubt, get some help from somebody who knows about GDPR and provide you with that tailored advice. It's important from both the business and the vulnerable individuals that you put in place the right approaches for your business circumstances.
Yes. So it really is then a big emphasis on tailoring that response.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
perfect. So when it comes to organisations, how do they respond to the risk that data poses to that individual?
In part, I've kind of answered this, I think, to a degree, but I think there are some additional points I'd like to make here, Helen. So the sort of thing I'd be thinking about, what sort of assessment have you made of the range of vulnerabilities facing your customers, or indeed your staff? And how have you used that information to influence your overall approach and the policies, and how you want to actually do that processing? Awareness training. What have you done as a business to ensure that your teams have had role-appropriate data protection training? And how often is that refreshed to make sure it's still live and working? Do you have in place quick response procedures if something goes wrong and there's a data breach, for example? How do you as an organisation or business react appropriately? How well positioned is your business or organisation with dealing with anyone seeking to exercise their enhanced rights under the regulation? For example, as a subject access request, That's the most common. And possibly lastly in this context, how has your business or organisation covered all the channels of communication with your customers so that it's able to engage with them appropriately and responding according to their specific circumstances? It's about tailoring again. But of course, much how the business or organisation responds to that sort of menu I've just given you will depend on its overall approach, its policies and its training around vulnerable customers, which I think is more your area of expertise than mine.
It is, yes. So obviously as an expert in this field, and you've probably seen businesses that you've worked with, what examples have you seen of good practice in organisations in recording and using personal information safely and securely and confidentially?
Yeah, it's very hard to give specific examples of good practice as it's rather dependent on the circumstance. It goes back to this tailored point again. However, those that have impressed me are typically ones that have looked at the issues in the round. For example, their approach goes beyond IT security, encryption and things like that. But it's also about the people policies, the training, the access controls, the documentation, this sort of thing, but also how they run their premises, in terms of who's allowed into which parts of the building, what controls there are, visitors, that sort of thing. So
yes.
It's in the round. If you
yes.
go back to that definition I gave about around security, it's in the round. It's just
yes.
not an IT issue.
No, that's brilliant. So what areas of the business should we be thinking about with regards processing personal data securely? Obviously, it's not just down to the frontline staff's responsibility, is it?
No, not at all. In the short answer, it's all aspects of the business need to be involved here. Front office, back office, senior management, etc. But again, it goes back to that core assessment of risk and a proportionate and tailored response. I mean, in the context of today's topic, I suppose it really reflects the nature and scale of that vulnerability, whether it's a permanent or transitory issue. In some ways, it might be more of a B2C issue rather than a B2B, but that would be not a hard and fast rule. And there is the related issue of our employees, which can fall into either or those broad categories.
So really sort of just bringing everything we've talked about to a summary, really, what practical steps should organisations be taking to ensure that they are compliant with the ICO when it comes to that vulnerable customer's personal data?
Again, sort of short, summarised answer, really, if I may. Firstly, write down and explain your approach. Documentation is key here. Review that on a regular basis and adjust it as needed. We live in a dynamic world. Remember that data protection is a live issue, not just something you do once, file and put away. It's there for good. Make sure your approach is understood throughout the business and that as a topic it features at the top end of the business. If you have a board, for example, it should be discussed at board level. Key here is leadership and buy-in at the senior level to make sure this happens. At a bit more practical level, there are things around making sure that you make effective use of the ICO guidance. More and more is coming out and it's getting more and more refined, so there is a repository of useful information there. There is a more technical point that, remember, you may need to be registered and there's a small fee to pay for that, but also if you don't pay, there is a larger fine. But at the heart of all this is the need that you, and the requirement really under GDPR, that you need to design your business approach to meet your customer needs, but also at the same time overlay that GDPR requirement to make the whole process work together.
Yes.
GDPR does not stand in isolation of your processes. It's an integrated part of them.
Yes. And it's that tailoring, isn't it? It's tailoring the response.
Yeah.
So that's great. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us. It's been absolutely great having you here as my guest, my very first guest on my podcast. So are there any additional points that you wanted to just leave our listeners with?
No, just to say thank you for being brave enough to ask me in.
You're very welcome. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Remember to subscribe to my podcast and leave a review. And you can also follow me on Twitter at HPettiferTrain. And I look forward to you joining me on my next episode.